Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, August 22nd, 2022, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And again, or I should say, as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I do want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, the show will always be 100% free to download as long as I'm able to make it. And that's really because I rely on the support of both my advertisers and of listeners just like you. And you'll see that very often I have episodes where there are no ads, like this week. There are still some dynamically inserted ads, but none that I read. And the income from those are significantly lower, sadly. And so, yeah, it's really the Patreon that keeps this thing chugging along. It keeps my incredible assistant, Noelle Dilworth, paid. It keeps my incredible editors at Pro Podcast Solutions paid. And it keeps me in a new laptop when mine shits the bed. Yeah, that totally didn't just happen. No, it did. It did. It was terrible. Anyway, let's dive into this week's episode. It's a really, really interesting one. It's a fun one. It's an important one. So, oh no, wait, before we dive in, I was just like giving a shout out to the patrons and I didn't call you out by name. Let's do that first. So I want to give a shout out to my top tier patrons this week. They include Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Dudas Infinitus, Gabriel F. Jaramillo Gonzalez, Joe Wilkinson, Leonard Prince, Pasquale Gelati, and Ulrika Hagman. And if you are interested in pledging your support on an episodic basis, all you've got to do is visit Patreon, that's patreon.com/talknerdy. All right, now we'll talk about the episode. So I had the opportunity to remotely connect with just like a total badass. She's a New York Times bestselling author. She's a zoologist, a National Geographic explorer, and just an all-around brilliant human being. And her name is Lucy Cooke. Her recent book is called Bitch, on the Female of the Species. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Without any further ado, here she is, Lucy Cooke. Well, Lucy, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. I'm looking forward to talking to you.
I'm so excited to have you here to chat about your new book, Bitch, on the Female of the Species. And of course, this book is both a biology book because your background is in zoology, but it also has some social implications as well. So maybe before we dive into the research that you did for the book, I would love to hear more about you and kind of what your journalistic focus has been throughout your career.
Oh, that's a great question. I'm really, I'm really interested in where human culture and animals meet. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm just really interested in that space, and so I guess I'm interested in bias a lot, and how the state of being human makes us interpret the world in certain ways, and how animals are important to us culturally. So I guess and quite a lot of my work has been in that area as a writer. My last book was very much in that area. So this is a sort of extension of that, really, I suppose.
I love that because I think we often, I come from the psychology tradition, but I also worked as a neuroscientist before I got back into psychology. And there is a small but interesting kind of subfield within psychology, which is like observational, naturalistic psychology. And I'm always fascinated when I read books by people like, I don't know, individuals who observe the natural world and grapple with these questions of how much are we anthropomorphizing these animals, but also how do I put this? I find that a lot of times people are very extreme on one end or the other. Either it's like my pet can empathize with me and my pet can read my mind, or you go to the other extreme where it's like they have nothing human, there's no theory of mind, we can't put any of our own views on them. But really it's somewhere in the middle, is it not?
Yeah, I'd say it's somewhere in the middle. And, what I think's kind of interesting is the way that we interpret animals actually has quite a lot to say about us. So,
right.
I think that that's quite an interesting space, is that a place where you can learn something new about the animal kingdom and maybe also learn something new about yourself as a human, and the way that you view the world.
Oh, absolutely. I'm immediately thinking of the sort of evolution of modern progressive society when it comes to the gender binary, or I should say the gender non-binary, when it comes to sexual orientation, and how much kind of we have to learn from the animal kingdom. Like how for so many years individuals made basically value judgments about human culture and human relationships and sort of superimpose them on natural relationships in the wild. And I guess it really took researchers who were like, I'm going to try not to think about this, or I'm going to try to expand my mind and observe what's actually happening and not say, well, this is what's happening because this is immoral or it's moral. What a complicated, like, how different would you say that things are now in, let's say, 2022 when it comes to discussions about sex and gender within the animal kingdom than it was, let's say, 100 years ago in 1922?
Oh, wow. I mean, really, really different. Yeah. I mean, much of how we understand the animal kingdom comes from the work of Charles Darwin. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you can go all the way back to Aristotle, actually, who thought of males as active and females as passive, based upon males producing active, wiggly little sperms, and females producing passive, sedentary eggs. And
Oh,
Darwin,
wow.
yeah, I know, which is insane, right? I mean,
Yes.
Aristotle was a genius. He was he was the original zoologist.
Right.
He created the science through creating the scientific method of observation, theorizing, and testing those observations and theories. So but he thought that there was this sort of fundamental link between gametes or sex cells that we produce, i.e., eggs or sperm, and then the sort of the resultant sort of defining characters of the sex. And he was not alone in thinking that, because there are people still walking the halls of universities today who will say that they do as well. Because Darwin also thought that. I mean, he must have read Aristotle, I think, and then he took things a step further with his theory of sexual selection, which was his sort of second great evolutionary theory, and he saw the sexes as sort of predetermined, really, that females generally were passive, coy, chaste, whereas males were active, ardent, and the dominant drivers of evolution. And so that was how he laid out things. And then, because he said that, all the scientists that followed in his wake suffered from a chronic case of confirmation bias and just saw what
Yeah.
Darwin had said because Darwin said it. But what's fascinating to me, Darwin is, I studied evolutionary biology, because, and I think Darwin's incredible. His theory of evolution by natural selection is an amazing piece of work, but he was still not immune to cultural bias. And, whether it was because he'd already caused such a stink with the church with suggesting that evolution was a thing and that we might have evolved out of the animal kingdom, and he'd had enough controversy for one lifetime, or whether it was because he really believed that females were passive and sort of bit part players in the evolutionary story, we'll never really know. But that it appears that he was very heavily influenced by the cultural norms of the time, which was a time where women were second-class citizens and were not considered to be as evolved as males.
Right.
So
Yeah. And you saw it. I mean, you saw it also with, it wasn't just gender, it was also with race. Like we saw this a lot in his writings.
yeah, and in actual fact, that's the same book. I mean, it's a kind of litany of shame for him now, really. The Descent of Man. I mean, there's some brilliant ideas in it, and the sort of fundamental basis of sexual selection, which is that, so just so that people understand the difference between natural selection and sexual selection. So natural selection is the idea that is sort of changed through time. Is the struggle for existence, basically, whereas sexual selection is the struggle for mates, basically, and that's what creates extraordinary ornaments and armaments that we see in the natural kingdom, like the horns of the stag or the peacock's tail, which can't be explained by the sort of utilitarian force of natural selection, because say take the peacock's tail. It's got to be a handicap to the peacock, right? They can't hide with that
Right.
big gaudy, great big look at me thing attached to it, and it can't. It makes it sort of it takes energy to produce. So Darwin was sort of obsessed with this, and he came up with this idea of sexual selection, and that was driven by male competition and female choice. Now he's right that male competition and female choice do drive these things, but also there are other forces at play that are active forces, like female competition and the sort of the antagonistic co-evolution between the sexes, and all these other things that he hadn't considered, because he didn't think of females as having such an active role and being competitive, for example.
And I mean, and that kind of view of not thinking of females as having such an active role of being competitive was a product of, we have to assume, the just probably the way that he thought about gender in general, just a deeply misogynistic and deeply sexist view of the role that women had biologically, socially, all of the above. It's funny, as you're pointing to some of these ideas, I'm thinking back to a podcast I did years ago with, I think his name was Richard Prum, who wrote The Evolution of Beauty.
Yep,
And
I've read it.
yeah, quite a lot about aesthetics and how this had to kind of be part of the conversation, but it was left out of a lot of these early evolutionary, I don't know, concepts, I suppose.
I mean, what's fascinating about Darwin is, he said that the sort of the two forces behind sexual selection were male competition and female choice. Now, he did give females agency, because female choice effectively shapes the evolution of the male. That meant that his, theory of sexual selection went down like a lead balloon in Victorian England. I mean, nobody,
Right.
people were like, hey, hang on a second here. It's men who control women, not the other way around, and also, as Prum writes so eloquently about, this idea of aesthetics, and that, Victorian men were just like, well, not even women can appreciate aesthetics in that era. They wouldn't, women weren't considered to be able to appreciate art, let alone a peahen appreciating the tail of a peacock, and shaping its evolution. So it's fascinating, as he gave them agency, but you can see him sort of dancing around that as well, because when he first lays out the theory of sexual selection, he says, that female choice, but they do it, albeit passively, so the males are sort of, they're duking it out, who's the best. And then the female sort of chooses, but sort of acquiesces in a kind of passive way. He's sort of, he gets really kind of tied up in how to say it, because he doesn't want to give the females too much agency, and then he doesn't want to give them any more agency than that, for sure. Certainly not in terms of sexual strategy and being as sexually precocious as males or as competitive as males.
Right. It's funny. It's this thing that you often see, and I see it here in the US. I was raised in the South, but now I live in a very liberal part of the country in Los Angeles. And this thing that you often see with deeply entrenched racism or sexism, where there's sort of a default view that individuals have that's quite regressive. And then they're like, oh, but there are some exceptions. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, but here's an exception to the rule. The rule still stands. Women are still quite passive. Women are still, incapable of appreciating beauty. But here's an interesting thing that maybe we could talk about. And so it's funny to see that opening of I guess insight. Clearly, Darwin was an incredibly insightful individual, and his observational powers were sort of unparalleled at the time, and he was quite brave for writing these. I mean, he struggled with it for years of his life before he wrote these things down because he knew what the backlash would be. But at the same time, he was not a sort of feminist champion by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, and I mean, I write about in the book. There's a very sort of, it may well be that he was a man who wasn't particularly interested in females. I mean, he married his cousin, and there's this. I've got it in the book, and I'll try and quote it off the top of my head as best as I can, but there is recorded this list he made up of the pros and cons of marriage before deciding
I remember
to marry.
that.
Yeah. and oh my God, it's so shameful. But so he's worried about missing the company of clever men at clubs and but then he thinks that a nice soft wife on the sofa would be better than a dog anyhow. So you sort of feel that the guy was maybe driven by cerebral rather than carnal urges. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Despite having 10 children, he may not have been that interested in females. So, the whole thing of science is, science is born out of questions, and people ask questions about things that they're interested in, and so, he maybe just wasn't that interested in females as well, or really even understood them, So I think it's not altogether surprising, but it is still shocking, if that makes sense, at how insidious cultural bias has been, and then how long it's taken to wash this sexist stain out of the science.
Well, and continuing to take. And I think you're right, because the point that I'm gathering that you're making is like the fundamental definition of privilege. They didn't have to think about it, so they didn't think about it because women didn't matter. They didn't matter medically. They didn't matter socially. And so it was very easy to only be concerned with the dealings of men because their entire culture was structured. And I keep talking in the past tense, but this is still the case to some extent. Clearly, it's not as bad as it was. But, after having lots of discourse with individuals like Angela Saini, for example, on the show about her book about the way that women are represented in medicine, after dealing with my own gynecologic surgery recently and having a friend who's very, very pregnant and who's struggling with wanting to labor and birth the way she wants to labor and birth, not the way that her male OBs want her to labor and birth. I'm continuously being reminded of how insidious male privilege is. It's not so much that they're like very often anti-woman, it's that they never even thought about it because they never had to.
Yeah, I think it's just like a focus shift, because the thing is, we've been, as a student, this stuff was drummed into me, right? I look through the world through that lens too, right? Because that's what I was taught, right?
Yep.
So it doesn't even matter. I mean, I ask questions from a female point of view, so I maybe interrogate those presumptions a little bit more. But essentially, I've got a biased view, and that's
how could you not?
What I've been taught, and I really realized that is that, as I was doing the research, I kept getting tripped up by thinking things like being, assuming male dominance, for example, or just because of the way that, the prism through which I've been taught to see the world, and I'm a woman, so it was fascinating to me on lots of levels to research this and see how far it spread, and also to sort of understand myself better.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's such an important, almost personal developmental insight that many women come to in a variety of fields and in a variety of academic pursuits is when we realize that, like you were talking about, uh, these biases, sexism, misogyny, that these are things that are so culturally promoted and so insidious that we internalize them ourselves and then we perpetuate them ourselves. And it's like so important that we're constantly doing the work to recognize that, because it's sort of the I've referenced this on the show before. Beverly Tatum, who wrote a wonderful book called Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, has this beautiful metaphor. And she's talking about racism, but she's basically saying if you're not actively anti-racist, you're part of the problem. And she envisions it like the moving sidewalk at the airport. Some people are running down the moving sidewalk. Some people are standing still, but they're still being carried. So unless you turn around and walk against the flow fast enough, you're part of that wave, and all of that, that kind of internal bias, it's still there.
I mean, absolutely. And, and I, that's why I dedicate the book to all the bitches in my life. Thanks for the
Yes.
inspiration, because that's true. Like I have got a really diverse set of friends, and taking one bias in particular is the sex binary, which is something that we're all sort of struggling with at the moment, or gender and sex. And I was taught that sex is binary, and I had and when I was researching the book in the early days, a friend of mine, a queer friend of mine said, "Oh, are you going to be talking about sex and gender?" And I was like, "Yeah." And she's like, "Well, what are you going to say?" And I was like, "Well, the way that I don't know, we define sex is in zoology is by the gametes, right? So whether if you produce sperm, then you're a male. If you produce eggs, then you're a female." And she sort of she was really interrogating me hard on this and sort of questioning the validity of that as a definition, in particular with regards to humans, but and it was that conversation, which was like a late night conversation, that actually spawned a huge amount of the book, because I did actually think to myself, well, yeah, well, maybe that isn't the best way, because as I've now discovered, there's a sperm and there's an egg, and there's there are only two options of gametes, but the manifestation of sex is anything but binary. I mean, sex is not a unitary phenomenon. It's composed of many elements in sexuality, sexual identity, sex behavior, and all of these exist on a spectrum. And even like trying to divide up whether an animal produces sperm or eggs, to put it in one neat binary box, doesn't also, isn't easy either. So it was that for me was really humbling, actually, was just to realize how important these conversations are, how important diversity is, and in terms of interrogating ideas, because I would have just, if I hadn't have had that late night conversation with that friend of mine, I might not have written the book that I wrote.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And how important this grappling, like you mentioned, with what we long described as a binary. I often like to think of it as somewhat bimodal, but that, historically, and I know this, I worked in biology labs, and I remember having a friend who had to gender flamingo blood. I think it was like there's some process to gender the flamingos in an effort to be able to do their work. And I think that what they would do back then is it was like male, female, male, female, male, female, something I can't identify, outlier. Like they wouldn't even consider it. It would just be like, oh, we'll put that in that pile over there, and that just won't be part of the experiment. And I think that's long how the biological world has grappled with these things. And there's almost like this out of like, oh, well, I'm only concerned with biology. I'm not concerned with behavior or sociology. So like leave that up to the philosophers. And that's a cop out, no?
Absolutely. And I mean, it's these outliers that are producing sort of fascinating revelations now. I mean, the first chapter in the book, I thought, well, like any good scientist, I'm going to start by defining my terms. What is a female? And actually, it's kind of complex, actually. Yeah, females produce eggs. But then in terms of sort of, if you were trying to sort of nail down the genetics, it gets really slippery really fast, So the thing that kind of, I spoke to this amazing, I mean, one of the joys of doing this was sort of basically kind of doing my own PhD with my own chosen tutors. Do you know what I mean? It was like,
Yeah.
I got to speak to all of these like extraordinary scientists, many of whom were females, but not all of them were women by any means. But Jenny Graves, who's been studying sexual differentiation and determination for donkey's years. She's in her, I think she's in her late 70s, early 80s now. Australian, brilliant, straight talking genius. And she's like decoded the sex chromosomes of everything from platypus, which have, by the way, 5 X's and 5, I think it's like 5 X's and 5 Y's. They've got like crazy sex chromosomes. And then to nematode worms, and she was part of the team that found the SRY, which of course is the trigger for the male pathway in human sex determination, or can be the trigger, or is the trigger. Sorry. So anyway, she explained to me, and it's just something really fundamental that I think everybody should know, which people don't, because it blew my mind when she told me. Is, I mean, I'd done genetics at university. I assumed, like many people, I would think that, females are XX and males are XY, and the genes that make you female are on the X chromosome, and the genes that make you male are on the Y, and that's how it works, right? That seems like, but when it comes to sex, nothing is that simple, right? Just nothing. And so, as it turns out, if in the case of a human, for example, or any mammal, actually, or any vertebrate rather, you're sexually neutral for the beginning, right? So the animal can develop into either a male or a female, and then something triggers the male or female pathway, and that happens first in the gonads, which take the pathway towards an ovary or a testes. And then that then perpetuates the continuation of that path, right? So you have in humans, that trigger is SRY gene. If you're a turtle, it might be the temperature that you're incubated at. There's all these different ways that the trigger can happen, but there's a trigger. And what was always thought was that these two pathways to being male or being female were linear and distinct. They are anything but. I mean, when Jenny sent, she's like, I'm going to try and explain this to you. I'm going to send you a diagram. It's an animated diagram, and it was like this machine that was full of cogs and wheels and little blue balls being crushed up and reformed and spat out and whirring through this massive thing of machinery. And she goes, "That's the pathway." And basically, it's neither linear or distinct. They're enmeshed. So the pathway to being male is enmeshed with the pathway to being female, and they work antagonistically. So all the time, the pathway to being male must also, genes on that pathway, suppress being a female. But the really, really extraordinary thing about it, that really blew my mind, is that the genes involved in that, other than the trigger, they're the same genes. The pathway to making a testes or to make an ovary, it's the same genes. I literally had to ring her 3 times and ask her, you've said it, I know, I just got to ask you again, Jenny, please don't put it comes to you, but I've just, she's like, yeah, the same 60 genes. Yeah, it's the same. It's the same. So you've got these same 60 genes that are working on these two pathways antagonistically. And, so you can see, therefore, how it throws up variation, and even the slightest tweak in that will throw up variation. Of course, variation's the grit that drives evolution forward. We don't have variation. We don't have an evolving system. So that's what
everything's
you want.
Just the same generation after generation.
Exactly. So this sort of anarchic system that throws out all of these different forms and these variations, that's what we need it to do. It's leaky, basically. That the system is leaky, and you might think, well, that's a mistake, but that's what evolution thrives off: leaky systems. You know what I mean? So I found that really compelling, because it helps you understand. We're kind of grappling with human variation. Well, it's all normal. It's part of an evolving system, and and I think when you see that variation in the context of the animal kingdom and what evolution can do with that variety, that's when it really starts to make sense, right? So I open the book with the story of the common garden mole. Like, it's a creature we all think, we're familiar with. It's probably ruined a few people's lawns who are listening right now. But the amazing thing about the female mole is that she's got ovotestes, so her ovaries are, well, her gonads rather, which is a word for both ovaries and testes. Lots of people think gonads just means male. That's another classic, but no, actually, hello everybody. Gonads means males and female sexual organs. But anyway, so her gonads are part ovary and part testicular tissue. And during the breeding season, the ovarian tissue pumps out eggs. And she, has sex, is pregnant, and gives birth like you would expect. But outside of the short breeding season, the testicular tissue swells and pumps out tons of testosterone. It doesn't make sperm, but it pumps out tons of testosterone. That makes her dig, like really, really hard, and be really aggressive when she defends her worm larder and her pups, So, but in order to it's flexible. It changes. The gonads actually change throughout the year, and that testosterone causes her vagina to seal up. So for the majority of the year, she's pumped full of testosterone. She's got no vagina. Her clitoris all year round looks like a penis. It's exactly the same as the male genitalia, and from a casual observation. And she's got more testicular tissue than she does ovarian, but she's a female still. But and we now know, because that we've decoded the genome of the mole, that that's just a mutation of two genes that regulate two other genes, right? Two proteins that regulate genes, right? Just two.
Wow.
But that's what I mean. But that's how you see this is sort of fantastic. This kind of crazy anarchic, antagonistic system. And you need all that variation, because hey ho, you might find yourself living underground one day, and and needing to have balls.
Yeah, so. yeah. I love that, and I think it goes to show, because we have so much conserved, right? We're not that different from moles. Like, yes, we're very different from moles, but we're really not that different from moles from an evolutionary perspective. Like, we're mammals. We're both mammals. We share a lot of conserved evolutionary path. And I think it goes to it speaks to the vast amount of variation that we see, not just in the sort of phenotypic like traits of humans and how they parallel with all sorts of different animals in the animal species, but also in behavior. And that's something that you write about quite a bit. You really do kind of turn on its ear this idea that we sort of opened the conversation with, that female members of the species are passive and receptive and maternal and, more empathic and more kind, and that the males are always the aggressive, kind of rapey, kind of warring, responsible, intellectual, like these terrible stereotypes that we see invade human family structures, invade human dating, invade human, honestly, like self-worth, sense of self, and invade the preconceived notions of biologists throughout a lot of our history when they're studying these different species.
Yeah, I mean, some of these, ideas are incredibly pervasive. So, and the sort of classic one, which is just, still considered by many to be, and I'm said this in inverted commas, a universal law, is the idea that, because males produce lots of mobile sperm, and it's cheaper to produce than a few sedentary eggs, then males will be promiscuous and females will be choosy and chaste. And that's like a fundamental dichotomy, right? And that is something that evolutionary psychologists love to use, about the human race as well. So but you find that's that it was actually it was first torn down by a bunch of brilliant American feminist scientists. So in particular, I'm thinking of Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy, who's an anthropologist, and Patricia Goati. And basically, the two of them in the early 80s sort of were the first to challenge this stereotype, because they were the first people to be out in the field observing females and who weren't behaving, as chaste and choosy, but were behaving in a highly profligate way. And rather than sort of walk away and go, oh, no, that doesn't fit the paradigm, we're just going to ignore that, go, oh, and question it, right? So in the case of Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy, she was studying langurs, and she saw that the females were actively soliciting sex from males outside the group repeatedly. And she discovered that was a strategy to counter infanticide. And that males are often infanticidal, and the reason why they do it is because if they're taking over a new territory, they want to mate with the females and for them to have their babies, right? Propagate their genes. So all the while they're nursing other males' babies, they're unavailable. So if they kill the babies, then the females come into estrus, become fertile much quicker, and are available. Well, the female counter strategy to that, which Sarah discovered, is that the females will mate with multiple males and solicit males outside the sex with males outside the group, and then males are less likely to kill babies if they've recently had sex with the female, and that,
right, because it might be theirs.
It might be theirs, exactly.
Yeah,
so it's a sort of animals don't recognize sex and pregnancy or whatever, but it's you can see how a simple rule, if I've had sex with that female, don't kill the babies, is going to be an evolutionary good idea, right? So, but she told me that, there was a huge amount of resistance to her coming up with this theory to start off with. She had professors turning around and saying things like, oh, come on, Sarah, just admit it, you're horny.
I'm not surprised. It's terrible.
It's just so terrible. And Patricia Goarty, who's just, oh my God, I love her so much. She's like this sort of feminist firebrand. I mean, she's just this extraordinary brain. She's so clever and fantastic and has done so much work in this area, a lot of which is dismissed, by the way, because she's an open feminist, which I find really, really irritating, because it's not like Darwin wasn't preaching from an ideological Bible as well.
It's not like every scientist doesn't come in with their own biases.
Exactly. Yeah. So at least she's open about hers. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly. Yeah.
And she's also the first to say that she chooses to co-author people who disagree with her, which is an incredibly brave move and not something that hardly anybody does professionally. But anyway, so what she did was that she was the first person to use paternity testing on a clutch of eggs, so she's like, those bluebirds hanging out on my window that seem to be so monogamous and building the nest together and raising the chicks. I don't know whether it's all so sweet at home. So, she tested the eggs and found that the frequently there were multiple fathers in a clutch of eggs. And when she presented this information, she was told that the only way that was possible was if the birds had been raped. Like, there's no way that females would be actively soliciting sex from other males. And it took putting radio trackers on the back of birds in order to establish that they were actually leaving the territory at dawn and going and soliciting sex from nearby males. And it makes perfect sense to Patty why they would do that. Why put all your eggs in one basket? You increase the genetic diversity of your offspring, you're more likely to have a winner amongst them. So it's interesting, this sort of both this resistance to these stereotypes. Like, the culture just wants to bash down the data all the time, because we just want to believe that females are don't have sexual agency, let alone females are taking pleasure from it, which we now, it's unequivocal in certain species. We know that, the dolphin clitoris, for example, is just as innovated as our own, and Patricia Brennan, who studies it, is certain that they have sexual pleasure. And, why wouldn't they? In evolution, you get rewarded for things that are fundamental, processes. Like, it feels good eating, it's good to have sex, because if you don't do it, you won't propagate the species. Do you know what I mean? Why would females be excluded from that? It's so nuts. But we like to think,
Yeah, and I also think that there's this short-sightedness when we think about, and this is a problem I think in a sort of concept of skepticism. I work quite a bit in science communication, but also skepticism. So scientific skepticism, critical thinking and applying evidence-based reasoning to social issues. And I think sometimes there's this mix-up where we want to think scientifically about a population, and then we apply population level ideas or insights to individuals, and it doesn't always compute. And so, not to be cryptic, but basically I'm going to be very sort of selfish and personal here for a second. Your book is quite reinforcing to me and validating to me as an individual woman in the world because of several things. First and foremost, and you may know this if we had to reschedule any of our recordings recently, but my listeners know this. I recently had to have a pretty severe surgery. I had to have a total hysterectomy due to a cervical cancer diagnosis. And I've been struggling with these gender norms and ideas about, in an effort to be inclusive, which I'm all about. I'm hearing a lot of conversations about the overturning of Roe v. Wade here in the United States, where people are saying things like individuals with a uterus instead of women, which is fair, right? Because we want to include trans men in this conversation. We want to include the non-binary individuals in this conversation. But now I feel excluded again, right? Because am I not a woman because I can't reproduce anymore? And then you add to that a very personal view of mine, which is that I am what I term, or not me, but there's a larger term here, ethically non-monogamous. I'm not married. I don't really believe in marriage. I think marriage I have problems with it under the patriarchal structure and the history of chattel slavery. And I date a lot, and I don't want to be monogamous. And I can't tell you how many people struggle to understand this worldview when I talk to them. How many people are like, oh, it's just because you haven't met the right person. Or, oh, it's you have to understand that just because you feel that way, nobody else on the planet does. And I'm always struggling with this conversation around, yeah, that's because they're socialized to think that way. It's not because they're biologically wired to think that way. But it's very, very difficult to live in a social structure that is so pervasive that it makes it hard to see outside of that social structure.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm so sorry that you had to go through that. I'm a breast cancer survivor myself, so I understand a certain amount of the torment that you've been through, but yours was much more hardcore. So props to you for getting through it and being able to talk about it.
And props to
Um,
you. Thank you for that.
um, but and I do hope that the book is helpful for women, actually, because I chose to write about a lot of the sort of stereotypes that are really commonplace. And for me, one of the ones that was really interesting is, like you, I've chosen not to well, I'm not married, and I've always dated a lot. So the promiscuity one was very interesting to me, as a general myth. The other one that was really fascinating to me was the myth of maternal instinct, because I'm just one of those women. I have just not got a maternal instinct. Like somebody,
Same.
my
Same.
friends,
Like
when they have a baby, they're like, "Do you want to hold the baby?" I'm like, "No. Its head looks wobbly. I don't want to touch that thing until it can speak."
yeah,
Like
and when I
really.
got my diagnosis, I remember my doctor saying point blank, she was like, I know we've had this conversation before. There are conversations we can have about preserving fertility. And I was like, nope. Like, we're doing the surgery tomorrow. Like, I've never, ever, ever had that draw. I don't want kids.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that blows people's minds. They're
It
like,
blows
you just,
people's.
you
Yeah,
it'll happen one day, or you just haven't come. Or I had, men on the internet who like I asked you for your opinion, literally saying things like freeze your eggs or you're going to regret it. And I was like, F you.
yeah, yeah. People really struggle with it, and
Right?
yeah, it's one of the sort of last taboos, really, in a way that I think we're kind of coming to terms with. That I feel less sort of confused and ashamed by it now, particularly having researched and written this book, because the idea that we're all women are are imbued with a mythical maternal instinct that enables them to sort of, love and intuit their offspring's every need is damaging for women like you and I who choose not to have children. But it's also damaging for mothers who really struggle with it, right? I mean, I've got tons of my female friends who are desperate to have babies, and then when they do, they they really find it difficult. They hate it, they or they can't do it, and there's basically just a ton of shame and baggage around motherhood, right? And how we're meant to feel. So I thought that was a really interesting subject. So again, my question is the maternal instinct real, right? Why? Am I some sort of genetic freak? Do I have a gene missing or something? Why don't I have it? And of course, I'm not a freak. You're not a freak. None of us are freaks. It's just that the instinct that exists, the instinct to nurture, first and foremost, it has to be triggered by something, right? It isn't just innate. It doesn't just, it needs to be triggered, right? We know that now. And that so much of motherhood has to be learned, Jean Altman's done this long-term study on baboons, which was just so fascinating. She was really the first person to kind of study motherhood. And, because the idea was, from Darwin's time through on and on and on, was that, all mothers are the same. Females all have a maternal instinct. They all reproduce to capacity. Nothing new there. We're all the same, right?
Right.
Just complete nonsense. Like when you look at the variation that we see. But, so she found that, it doesn't matter, first time baboons really struggle. And their firstborn is 60% more likely to die than subsequent babies because that learning curve is steep, and lots of babies die because they've got to learn how to breastfeed. They've got to learn how to carry the baby, keep up with the troop. They've got to, there's like a ton of stuff. It's the same, right?
And it's the same for us, yeah. And I think in other species, you also see examples where there's like kinship raising of young, and where the women who give birth learn from other women within the group, because they wouldn't just naturally know what to do.
Yeah, I mean, you see a lot of kind of crashing behavior and females sort of, acting together to raise babies, even amongst like these black and white rough lemurs that I went to Andrea Barden studies in Madagascar, and, they build nests, and then they crash the babies in these nests high up in the trees so that the females can go off and forage all day. And there's like a babysitter for the crashed babies. And that may be a male, it may be a female, but it's always it's a friend-based thing, not even a kin-based thing.
Oh, cool. So, yeah, and don't they also like get it on, a lot of the females in certain lemur species? Like there's this kind of like co-parenting situation, but there's also like a lot of lesbian sex.
Oh, I didn't know that. You told me something I didn't know. Oh, I think God, I love that. Well, they've got enormous clitorises.
Yeah.
they because they're female dominant. 90% of lemurs are female dominant, and so they've got very prominent clitoris. They're almost impossible to recognize from the male. So it's all out there to have fun with. So I'm not surprised that they
love
are.
It. Love it.
It's a great way to bond and make friends.
I know.
Sex isn't just about reproduction. Which is another Victorian idea. Sex has all sorts of functions. I mean, bonobos have formed a sisterhood by having sex with each other, and they've managed to overthrow the patriarchy. They're a female dominant species, despite being smaller than the males. So yeah, it's entirely possible.
I love it. I want to be a bonobo. I love bonobos. They're amazing, and how fun to be able to study them and write about them as well. I feel so terrible because I feel like we could talk for hours and hours and hours, but I also know that you're like on a book tour and you're working really hard and you're in the UK, so it's getting late. And I don't want to keep you all day. I was hoping that I could ask you one final question before I bid you adieu. So, Lucy, I ask all of my guests on the show the same closing pair of questions because I'm curious about their insights based on the work that they do. These are sort of big picture, so kind of bear with me. But first, I would love to know, in whatever context is relevant to you, this could be personal, it could have to do with your work, it could be like local or global or whatever. Number one, what is the thing that's been keeping you up the most at night recently? What are you concerned about? Where are you, maybe struggling even with pessimism or cynicism? But then to end on a more positive note, on the flip side of that, where are you finding your hope, your optimism? What are you looking forward to genuinely?
Yeah. So, I mean, the thing that's keeping me up at night that I'm most concerned about is climate change. With that, it's just, keeping me up at night just because it's so freaking hot. I can't sleep at night.
Oh, right. You guys are in a terrible heat wave in the UK right
Yeah,
now.
it's just crazy. And, yeah, it's just, I mean, it's nice. We don't often have sunny summers in England, but, it's also absolutely terrifying. So that keeps me awake at night. What gives me hope? Well, what gave me hope writing the book is I do feel that, the thing about culture is it does move forward. Sometimes it feels from the life perspective of a lifetime like it's really slow. But actually, when you look at it over time, culture does change, and I really hope that we'll have sort of the fact that we're discussing these things more now. People can be open about their sexuality and their gender identity, and they can bring questions to science that haven't been asked before. Will reinvigorate our understanding of the natural of the animal kingdom, and then the knock on will be that will also help us understand ourselves better as well. So I think that this sort of move towards diversity, which is so needed, is it has started. The conversations are happening. We're recognizing that bias is a thing, and in all senses, and so that gives me hope for a kind of a better future.
Oh, hear, hear. Well, everybody, the book is Bitch on the Female of the Species by Lucy Cooke. Lucy, thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, thank you so much. It's just been a joy to speak to you. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, I feel the same way. And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.